Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'll echo Dr. Kaiser's words in the beginning and thanking everybody, and it's an honor to be here. So as Dr. Kaiser eloquently prefaced in her talk, despite making great strides in gender and racial equality in the United States, but also abroad in countries like Japan, it's clear that minorities and women in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics domains still experience significant roadblocks as they progress through the upper echelons of these STEM fields and academia. In the United States, we have a very well-documented effect referred to as the Leaky Pipeline, which basically highlights that from about the time of high school all the way through college and into graduate school and into at the higher levels of academia, basically women leave these STEM fields at disproportionate rates compared to men, such that by the time women get into particular fields like physics or computer engineering, there's only about 10% representation of women compared to men. So these are kind of overt patterns that are very clear, but these patterns are often underscored by more insidious patterns in the population. For instance, in a recent meta-analysis by Elsquest and colleagues in 493,000 boys and girls, they found that while there were variable differences in performance that actually varied as a function of how misogynistic a culture the children were reared in, where girls systematically differed from boys is in how they felt about math. They reported more negative math attitudes, more math anxiety, and lower math confidence. So even though boys and girls were performing comparably to one another, girls were walking away from these situations feeling a lot worse about themselves and much less confident about themselves in the math domain. And while there are a host of explanations that have been provided to account for these findings that range from biological all the way to sociological, a lot of my research focuses on how negative stereotypes about women's math ability and the expectations that we hold for women in these STEM domains may actually alter how these individuals process information and remember information at a very basic level. So today what I'm going to talk a lot about is a phenomenon we refer to as stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is a situational stressor that targets of negative stereotypes experience when they fear that their actions or their behaviors or their performance may inadvertently confirm a negative group stereotype. And these fears or these stressors actually have the ironic consequence of the individuals confirming the stereotype. So in a traditional stereotype threat study, women are led to believe that they are taking something like a diagnostic math test, and they are reminded of their gender by simply marking a box indicating their gender before they complete that test, and then they actually underperform on that test accordingly. But if you tell the woman that they're going to take a problem-solving task, right? So you're just changing the frame of that test or that math test that they're taking, and you don't have them mark their gender before they take the test, they perform the same as men on these tests. So these situations are these stereotype threatening situations are fairly easy to engender or bring about. Women can simply be outnumbered by men in a given context, or be told that they're taking these diagnostic math tests and marking their gender. So in other words, just telling them they're going to perform in this situation where their group isn't expected to do well, and being reminded that they are a part of that group accordingly. We've argued in some of our theoretical models that once stereotype threat is primed, once these situations are present, it elicits a cascade of stress responses and negative appraisal processes and performance monitoring processes that can work either alone or in concert to tax something that we call working memory, which is a cognitive process that's really important for doing things like complicated math problems. So, when you're solving these word problems on these math tests, where they say, like, Jane is traveling 60 miles an hour east and Joan is traveling 70 miles an hour west, and who's bringing the sake or something like that, and you're thinking, I don't even remember where sake was involved in that situation, right? That's a very working memory intensive process. And so what we argue is that when women are in these contexts where stereotype threat is primed, that cognitive process is being taxed specifically, and that undermines their performance on more difficult math problems specifically. As you can kind of gather from this model, this is a complicated process, and there's a lot going on at any given time. And so my research incorporates a more neuroscience-oriented approach. I use neuroscience methodologies like electroencephalography, or EEG, and functional magnetic resonance imaging to basically tap into these types of cognitive processes that I'm talking about by looking at brain regions that are really important for these different cognitive processes. I'll be talking about some of these brain regions in more detail as we go along, but the basic idea is the research that I look at uses activity in these brain regions that are involved in these different cognitive processes that I think are important under stereotype threat. And we examine how these regions kind of talk to each other and work in these situations, and that informs our understanding of the stereotype threat phenomenon. So as I kind of alluded to, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is this idea that stereotype threatening situations, or these socially threatening situations, are actually physiologically stressful to individuals. So when women are under stereotype threat, they have been shown to elicit increased blood pressure, increased sweat responses, increased activity in brain regions that are important for controlling emotions. And that suggests that these situations are stressful in and of themselves. So when women find themselves in these situations where, say, maybe they're outnumbered by men in a classroom or in a laboratory setting, that may prime this basic stress response that we know from a lot of other literature recruits similar brain regions and body and elicits bodily reactions that would be not unlike what people elicit to any kind of stressor or any kind of that they would elicit in any kind of stressful situation. So I'm not saying that when women find themselves in STEM contexts that they feel like they're going to be attacked by a lion or something like that. But the same kind of response that somebody would experience when they maybe think a lion is around might be a similar kind of response that women experience when they find themselves in these stereotype threatening situations. So we can take that information and make interesting predictions as to how information is going to be processed in stereotype threatening contexts by women. And specifically, what I look at is a phenomenon we refer to as mood congruent memory encoding, which is a theory or is a finding in the cognitive neuroscience literature that highlights that when people are in situations where they're experiencing negative emotions, so they're not feeling very good about themselves, or they're feeling kind of negatively emotionally aroused, and they're also experiencing these physiologically arousing responses, they will actually remember information that's consistent with that affective state, that emotional state, compared to information that is inconsistent with that mood state. So in other words, if somebody is not feeling very good, if they're feeling negative emotions, they're going to remember information that is consistent with that mood state. They're going to remember negative information compared to more positive information or neutral information. There's another side of that coin, and that which would be, of course, if people are experiencing positive emotions, then they're going to be more likely to remember information that's consistent or that's positive and consistent with that mood state. So if we take those findings and apply them to the stereotype threat literature, we can make hypotheses based on that suggest that when women find themselves in stereotype threatening situations, to the extent they experience these negative affective states and this physiological arousal, they're going to remember information that is consistent with that mood state better than information that is inconsistent with that mood state. So we tested these ideas and made this basic hypothesis that when women are in stereotype threatening situations, when they receive information that is consistent with that negative stereotype or confirming that negative stereotype, in other words, finding out that they solved a problem incorrectly, a math problem, They're going to remember information that's associated with that incorrect feedback better than information that's inconsistent with the stereotype or inconsistent with that process. So in these initial studies, we had men and women placed under stereotype threat or not. And to do that, in my lab, we have a very straightforward approach. We either tell women and men that they're going to take a diagnostic math test and mark their gender before they complete the test. That's two conditions that are necessary for the stereotype threat effect. And women complete they complete the math test in the presence of other men. Or we tell women and men that they're completing a problem-solving task, so we change the frame of that math test. They're all doing the same math test. And then we don't have them mark their gender beforehand. So we don't give them those, we don't frame the test in the same way, and that doesn't evoke this stereotype threat response. And then what we did was we had individuals complete something that I call the math font feedback task. And this task was designed to be kind of easy because we didn't want these typical stereotype threat performance effects to manifest and bias the amount of information that people were receiving. But the goal was to basically provide individuals with meaningful or truthful feedback after every time they solved a problem, and to provide them in turn with information that could potentially be remembered in conjunction with this solving these problems incorrectly or not. So basically, people would be presented with problems like this, and if they solved the problem correctly, they would receive truthful feedback that might look like this. We would actually put this like correct feedback in the middle of the screen, and we would write it in a font like this, or we might provide it in a font like that. Conversely, if they solved the problem incorrectly, they would get feedback saying that they solved that problem wrong, and they might see wrong written like this, or they might see wrong written like that. Now, this looks kind of funny, but basically what it provides us with is a means to assess how women and men are processing that feedback and unique information presented with that feedback on a trial-by-trial basis. And the basic idea is when they get this kind of feedback saying that they got a problem wrong, for women who are under stereotype threat, that suggests that they just confirm that stereotype, right? That women aren't as good at math as men. And they're going to remember that information better than the information that suggested that they answered the problem correctly. So after this font feedback task that we created, then individuals completed a more traditional math test that has these kind of standard difficult math problems. And then we gave participants a surprise memory test. And so we actually would present them with the fonts that they saw before, the font feedback pairings, and we just say, did you see that before? Did you see the wrong feedback before? Did you see the correct feedback before? And we would throw in other information that would kind of help us determine whether they were guessing or not. And then we asked them how anxious they felt after the task. So importantly, in these initial studies, we found that performance on the math font feedback task between men and women was comparable. So women and men performed pretty much the same, right? So they were seeing the same amount of wrong and correct feedback in those different kind of funny-looking fonts, right? But what we found, what wasn't the same was how women and men performed on that memory test that we gave them after they had solved all of those math problems and seen all of those different fonts. And so here we have, on our x-axis, we have women taking the diagnostic math test and men taking the diagnostic math test compared to women who are taking the problem-solving task and men taking the problem-solving task. And here we have participants' memory scores where higher numbers mean that participants remembered those things better. So basically what we found was even though women and men were performing comparably on this specific math test, women under stereotype threat were remembering the fonts that were associated with that wrong feedback much better than those fonts that were associated with the correct feedback. And everybody else wasn't really remembering those fonts very well. It wasn't really they weren't really processing it in any kind of biased way. So even though women were performing the same, they were processing and remembering the information that was associated with that stereotype, that negative stereotype, better than information that was inconsistent with that stereotype. So we've replicated these effects in different ways. and found that extends to information that is even just presented, kind of neutral information that's presented with the stereotype confirming evidence. And in another study, we sought to test whether these effects endured over time. So now we have women and men completing the same task, but then they go away for a week, right? So they see these fonts one time, and then they come back a week later, and we put them under stereotype threat again, and the women under stereotype threat, and we say, do you remember this stuff that you saw one time a week ago? And what we found was actually consistent with a tenet of stereotype threat theory, was that it was the women who cared the most about math, the math domain, the women who liked math, who really wanted to succeed in math. They were actually the most likely to remember this feedback up to a week later. So here we have math identification on our x-axis, where higher numbers mean people like math better. They feel like it's a more important part of who they are. On the x-axis, we have these memory scores again, and basically we find that when women were under stereotype threat, they remembered those fonts associated with the wrong feedback much better, to the extent they really liked the math domain. More recent evidence in our lab has turned to the brain to kind of inform our understanding of this phenomenon. So we look at a specific part of the brain called the amygdala. This part of the brain is really important for the experience of emotion and arousal. And again, we're arguing here that these effects are due to this arousal component. So when people are under stress, their amygdala is more active, and we think that this memory process is a result of that stressful response. And so basically what we've found is when we've looked at amygdala activity, which we've operationalized here, is something we call startle feedback, which I could talk about later if you want, but I won't bore you with the details. Basically, we found that when you look at the amygdala activity in response to correct feedback in comparison to women and men's memory for that correct feedback, there's no differences. However, when we look at that in relation to wrong feedback, so amygdala activity in response to wrong feedback, and in relation to their memory for the wrong feedback, it's women under stereotype threat who remember this negative information better, to the extent their amygdala is active in response to this feedback. So we've also further elaborated what are the downstream effects of these types of phenomenon, of these memory encoding biases. And basically what we found are these interesting path models which indicate that when women have this kind of biased encoding of information on an initial test, on this initial font feedback task, that actually predicts underperformance on a downstream difficult math test, so that second math test. And that in turn predicts increased anxiety. So in other words, we kind of find some evidence for a mechanism for those initial else quest findings I discussed in the beginning, where even though men and women are performing comparably to each other, women walk away feeling more anxious and more negative math confidence, and that might be in part due to this negative encoding bias that they exhibit under stereotype threat specifically. So these deleterious consequences of stereotype threat are clear, but importantly, we've also found in our lab that not everybody is susceptible to these effects. In fact, the valence of thoughts might differ among those who are better able to cope with or anticipate these emotional reactions or stressful reactions that individuals have under stereotype threat. So to this, we turn to the brain again to look at how activity between different regions that are important for self-regulation or feeling a kind of being able to cope with situational stressors, we looked at how activity between these regions might vary as a function of individuals, and how that in turn might affect how people feel about themselves under stereotype threat. So in this study, we again gave participants a task that provided them actually with comparable amounts of feedback. So people performed comparably on this task. But importantly, we framed it as either diagnostic of intelligence in this stereotype threat condition or not. And then we recorded activity between these brain regions that we thought were important for emotion regulation. I realized actually when I was making this probably makes a lot more sense to you than it does to our American participants. They don't know what the heck this is, but you guys can tell me what it means later, actually. But basically, so what we found was that we found these kind of individual differences in how people can cope with emotional stressors actually predicted who was going to feel better or worse under stereotype threat. So here we have activity between brain regions that are important for this emotion regulation and coping. Here we have our minority participants and our white participants. Basically, we find that minorities think they do a lot worse on the test than they actually did when these parts of the brain aren't talking very well with each other. When these parts of the brain talk well with each other, minorities think they did a lot better. In other words, when they were able to cope with these stressful situations, they are actually monitoring their performance accurately. And that also manifested in how they felt about themselves after stereotype threat. So when minorities were exhibiting this kind of this better ability to regulate these emotions, they thought that they didn't feel very much doubt after these stereotype threatening performances, whereas those that were exhibiting that lack of communication, the ones that were not as capable of, or not as regulating those emotions as well, they felt a lot more self-doubt. So I just presented some information I hope you enjoy that suggests that it's important to keep the context in mind and think about the target's perspective, individuals who are the targets of negative stereotypes in our society, and understand or be sensitive to the fact that these situations can change how people process information and how they ultimately feel about themselves. But if we can incorporate methods that help individuals to regulate these emotions or these negative experiences or stressors they're experiencing, that might have these downstream, more positive consequences for how they feel about themselves and want to stick around in these domains specifically. So I wanted to just thank everybody, thank NSF for the funding for a lot of this stuff, as well as Tessa West and members of my lab who without none of this would be possible. Thank you very much.